there's a new house. Now we got to be clear here. Houses are the factories. A house is a factory. It produces housing services. A hospital, it's a factory. It produces medical services. A farm, it's a factory. Produces agricultural products. Okay? A school, that's a factory. It produces educational services. So if you think about it in that concept, a house is a factory. So we're going to count the value of the home, that value of that house, as investment spending. But that house into the future is going to produce housing services each month. And so when that house is occupied, either by someone that's being renting it or owner occupied, then that creates housing services. And the housing services are counted under consumption. But the house itself is fixed residential. So fixed residential, that's any structure that people are going to reside in. That's going to be condominiums, that's going to be duplexes, it's going to be single family homes, townhouses. So those things are going under fixed residential investment. Okay, hopefully that clarifies for you. Let's get another one here. The next category is fixed business investment. We kind of talked about that. Those are the things, those are the machines, tools, and factories that the businesses are making. That, and in this sense, factories people aren't going to be living in, such as a school. So now, a private school, I should say, because if we build a school, a public school, that's government spending. Okay. All right. I think that gets the point across. I'm trying to think here real quick if there's anything that's troubled anybody before. Let's get to the third category under investment. Because that one's a little bit tricky, but it sounds like you guys had some great examples. I was hearing some of the discussion, and Mr. Kozon has some great experience working in inventory. So changes in business inventory. And so we gave some examples. Maybe a company starts the year, say a car dealership starts the year with 200 cars on the lot, and they finish the year with 300 cars on the lot. Now, obviously, they're not the same cars. They've had some turnover. But what's happened is their inventory has increased during that year. And we need to account for that because, remember, we're looking for all the goods and services that are produced in an economy, not the ones that are sold. And so those extra 100 cars that have not been sold, we need to add their value in. And so changes in business inventories. Now, if we actually ended the year with less than 200, say we ended with 150, we would actually subtract out because we have a lower inventory. So that's an investment in inventories. And it's the change from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. It's pretty simple if a business just starts, because if they just start and they get an inventory at the end of the year, we just add in the whole inventory. But as that company goes the next year, it's how much did they change their business inventory by. Okay? So that was investment. All right? Government spending. Government spending, I mentioned earlier, it's all levels of government spending. Federal, state, and local. But remember, the spending has to be on goods and services. A paycheck to a guy in the military, that counts because they have provided a good or a service. They provided these military services. Okay, a paycheck to a police officer, a fireman, a school teacher, those get counted. However, a Social Security check, a welfare check, there's been no good or service that has been given to the government in exchange for that money. No good or service was produced, therefore it is not included. Those, remember, we call transfer payments. Okay, so hopefully we got that clear for you. And make sure you understand that. The other thing is federal, state, and local. So if we're going to give the subcategories, we're going to say government spending. That paycheck to the guy in the Army, that's government spending. Federal, but then the federal gets broken down into two parts. That is defense and non-defense. So in this case, the answer I'm looking for is government, federal, defense. Okay. Now, what if we talked about the money spent on the salary of an employee at the Department of Agriculture? That's going to be federal, Department of Agriculture, U.S. Department of Agriculture, USDA, and that's going to be, so federal, government, federal, non-defense. Okay. Now, we could also have something that's a state, fixing a pothole here in a state comes and does that. Okay, maybe some local roads, but I'll specify, and you want to be able to break that down. So federal, we want to break down into defense or non-defense. Okay, all right, now, and then exports and imports, I think, are pretty straightforward. One of the things I think is important there is to specify whether or not it's a good or a service. And in fact, when you look at the tables, they have it divided in goods and services. And I always tell people, be careful what you hear in the media, because sometimes when they talk about the trade balance, and I'm not trying to say that we don't have a trade deficit. We have a trade deficit. But a lot of times when they report the trade deficit, they only report the deficit in goods. And what you'll find is that when we start looking at the services, and we add the services in, our deficit is not as bad. That doesn't mean it's not a huge deficit. However, we got to count the services. Sometimes people go, America, they don't produce anything anymore. Services are things, okay? And so we can't discount those, okay? If we're producing services, medical services, educational services, those are important things to be produced. So, let's see, what are some of the tricky ones? Now, there's a question that got emailed to me, Mr. Cozone forwarded to me. You guys asked about this. You said, if Apple makes laptops in China and then they sell them over here, does that get counted? That's a great question, because you go, well, hey, Apple's a U.S. company. But it's not about who owns the company. It's about where the goods were produced. They were produced in China, and we bought them in the U.S. That's a U.S. import. We imported those. Now, here's where it gets a little bit tricky. Say we get some automobiles that are manufactured, maybe they make some parts down there in Texas, and then they take and ship those parts down across the border to Mexico, and then they make they produce the automobile there, and then they send it back. Holy smokes, that gets tricky, because what we're going to do is we're going to count this. The goods that we exported to Mexico as exports. So how much wheat was produced in the U.S., we export it to Mexico. But then when we add in the import, remember the import has, oh my gosh, we sold an intermediate good. We sold parts. And we said we didn't want to count that, but we want to count how much of it was produced in the U.S. So if we take and we subtract out we add into our GDP what we exported, the value of the parts, but then we subtract the value of the cars when we import those cars, effectively what we've done is we've only counted the value of what was produced in the U.S. We've taken out the part that was the part of the value that was produced in Mexico. Does that make some sense? Okay. So we want to be careful about that. In fact, it gets a little bit more tricky even. If we buy these computers, okay, and this is one I just want you to think about. Hey, how are these included? Are they not included? Those would be imports. But if we're looking about the impact on GDP and how it's recorded, and this is kind of sophisticated, and this is a little bit beyond what I want, but I might give a bonus for this kind of analysis. When we buy those Apple computers made in China, that actually goes under consumption. Okay? But also, okay, we're going to do it out of imports. And so what happens is that effectively, because we've recorded it in two different spots, it doesn't get counted to GDP. Does that make sense? Because remember, we said goods and services that are produced outside of the country shouldn't be counted in GDP. So we added in consumption. It's a good that was consumed, but we subtracted out in the imports, so there's no impact there on our GDP, what was produced, the value of what was produced. So sometimes that's a little tricky thing there. Okay? Trying to think what some others are. You know what? Here's one. Purely financial transactions, and you have some of those on the Practice Big Quiz. Purely financial transactions, if I buy stocks or bonds, no good or service was produced, doesn't get counted. Household production. Someone takes care of their kids at home, that value doesn't get produced or doesn't get included. However, if they take their kids to a daycare, now it does get included. And that's a little tricky because, like we said with the housing, we go, gosh, we kind of want to include that. And there are some economists who spend some time trying to figure what GDP would be if we included household production. Okay? There are a lot of things, though, in the economy, though, too. I mean, we talk about here the environment, GDP. You know, sometimes people say, well, you know, since we don't deal with the environment, there are negatives. There's costs that we impose on the environment, but also the benefit. The benefit of sitting here on a sunny day down here in La Jolla and, you know, walking around, that's a positive. Don't we want to include that? Problem is we don't have a market value for that. So environmental goods and services and environmental bads are not included in GDP. That's one of the things. Remember, GDP is not a perfect measure of standard of living. By no means is it a measure of standard of living.